Now, Mark's Gospel is a book that often gets divided into three main sections. And this outline that is about to come up on the screen is going to show us the titles of these three main sections. The first section, as you can see there, is from Mark chapter 1 all the way to chapter 8, verse 26. A section that is all about the events of Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee. Next, you've got the second section there from Mark chapter 8, verse 27, all the way through to the end of chapter 10, a section that consists of a long journey that Jesus and his disciples take from Galilee to Jerusalem. And then lastly, you've obviously got the third and final section there from Mark chapter 11 all the way to the very end. And that is a section that is all about the events of Jesus' ministry in and around Jerusalem, leading up to the cross. And what you probably just noticed as we've read our passage today is that we have now finished with the first section about Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee, and are now entering into this second section here. A section where we are now, over the next few chapters, going to go on a journey with Jesus and his disciples as they take a long trip from Galilee to Jerusalem. And what we're going to see about this second section here is that it's actually very different to the other two sections of this gospel. Because in the first and third sections, Jesus' ministry is primarily aimed towards the large crowds of people. Whereas here in this second section, as we're on this trip with Jesus and his disciples take from Galilee to Jerusalem, Jesus' ministry is this time primarily aimed towards his 12 disciples, who are currently with him here on this trip. And what is clear here from this second section is that Jesus' goal for this long trip here is not just to teach his disciples about anything and everything. And though Jesus' goal for this trip here is to teach his disciples primarily about one important thing in particular: discipleship, which is the teaching on how they are to live as true disciples of Jesus. And that is because, after all, the cross is fast approaching. And therefore, Jesus needs this quality time here with his disciples on this trip in order to get them ready for what awaits them in Jerusalem. Now, seeing as though Jesus' goal for this long trip here is to teach his disciples mainly about discipleship, it therefore shouldn't come as a surprise then to hear that the primary theme of this whole second section over these next few chapters is this theme on discipleship. And therefore, because we Christians today are actually considered disciples of Jesus too, this teaching then from Jesus about discipleship is also clearly supposed to be very practical for all of us today too, and how Jesus wants us to live as true disciples of him today. And when we come to our passage here today, in verses 34 to 38, what we notice is that we've actually got our first big block of teaching by Jesus on this theme of discipleship. And therefore, as we unpack this teaching from Jesus here, what I want to do is I want to break this passage up into two sermons over two different times in order to help us understand it better. The first sermon today is going to just be on the one verse 34, which explains what we are to do. And then next time in sermon 2, we're going to look at the other four verses 35 to 38, on why are we to do it. Two sermons, what are we to do, and why are we to do it? So let's spend our time then today in sermon 1 looking at just the one verse today, verse 34, what are we to do? So let's read verse 34 together and let's see what we are commanded to do. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now what we notice about verse 34 here is that Jesus gives his disciples here three commands which make up what we are to do today. And what we notice about these three commands here is the seriousness of them. Because as we can see here, it's not like Jesus gives us an option here, does he? As to whether we feel like obeying these three commands or not. No, what does Jesus say here? Whoever wants to be my disciple must, he says here. These commands are a must for a true disciple of Jesus to do today. And these 3 commands here, as you can see, are for the disciples too. Number 1, deny themselves. Number 2, take up their cross. And number 3, follow Jesus. So let's look at the first of these 3 commands here then, the command to deny yourself. Deny yourself. Now, ever since sin has entered the world, as we know, the human race has just to continue to become less and less focused on God and others, and instead have become more and more obsessed with the self. In fact, this obsession with the self is just being fueled even more today, just all the time with the current influences of our culture today. For instance, one of the biggest industries in our world today that is just absolutely booming at the moment is the popular self-help industry. The industry that is all about how to improve the self. 2 years ago, at the end of 2023, this self-help industry was actually calculated to be worth $41.23 billion US. Self-help content is literally taking over. As some of us have already seen, it's the main topic talked about in most podcasts today. In fact, the popularity of self-help content today is one of the main reasons why podcasting has taken off in the way that it has in recent years. In addition to that, self-help content is filling our bookstores. It's flooding our YouTube channels. It's engulfing social media platforms. And it's sadly even infiltrating the teaching of some of the mega churches across the world today. In fact, self-help content has become so popular today that our society today are not only celebrating it, but are now even turning to it as the answer and the solution to how to live a more fulfilled life. Society's answer today to how to live a more fulfilled life is not God, not Jesus, not even family. Now, society's answer on how to live a more fulfilled life today is to both improve the self and improve your life. 2 things that demand such a diligent focus on the self. A lifestyle that is just breeding a society today that is obsessed with the self. And therefore, that is why this teaching here by Jesus to deny the self is just so countercultural today, because it just completely goes against what society are both celebrating and turning to today. Because Jesus is not commanding us here to focus on the self less. No, Jesus is calling us here to completely, quote, deny the self. He's literally calling us to put our sense of self to death, deny it, which is the complete other end of the extreme of what society today are calling us to do. Society today are calling us to put our focus on the self. Whereas Jesus here is calling us to completely and utterly deny the self. Now, when Jesus calls us to deny the self here, he's not calling us to just stop everything that in any way helps the self, as if we should stop eating well or exercising or showering or looking after ourselves in general. Now, what Jesus means by this command here to deny the self is that we are to deny our self-promoting attitude. Or in other words, we are to deny any desire within us that wants to promote the self. And therefore what that means is that it's actually our heart's motives that dictate whether we are in any given moment denying the self or not. And therefore the question that we need to constantly be asking ourselves surrounding this command is, what are my motives lately? Behind my thoughts, my decisions, and my actions? Are they a means to promoting God's glory and promoting others? Or are they a means to promoting the self? Why am I truly doing this? Why am I truly doing that? Why am I truly making that decision instead of that? Why am I truly chasing after that? The question that we need to be constantly asking ourselves surrounding this command behind every thought, every decision, and every action is why? I actually asked myself this question recently when not too long ago, myself, Steph, and our two kids met up with my in-laws at a local cafe for a quick coffee. We walked to our table, sat down, and Ollie, our 2-year-old, of course, decides he doesn't want to sit at the table that day. He wants to run off and play. And after many attempts to try and just to sit him still at the table, I all of a sudden end up allowing the phone to come out so that he can watch some videos just to keep him still and quiet at the table. Purely because I just wanted to sit down with some peace and quiet for just a little bit and enjoy a nice coffee with my wife and in-laws. Now, whether you're a parent here today or not, you probably know that is rule number 1 of what not to do as a parent. Something I promised myself that I would never do. Yet here I was, allowing my son to watch videos at the table instead of telling him off for not listening to me. In that moment, I failed to deny the self. Yes, a lot of the times we do this subconsciously, but that's what so often happens, doesn't it? When we are so focused on the self that we don't even realize when our self-focused nature is harming the people around us. And therefore, that's why asking ourselves these questions of why constantly, daily, is just so important for all of us to do. So that we too can identify where this obsession for the self exists in our own lives and then actively putting it to death, as Jesus calls us to do here. According to Jesus here, we are to deny the self. Take our attention off the self. Kill off any desire within us that wants to promote the self. And instead focus our complete attention on promoting God's glory as well as promoting others. Verse 34 again, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. All right, let's now take a look at the second of these 3 commands here, the command to take up your cross. Take up your cross. Now, unlike today, where each country is mostly in charge of their own country today, there was actually a time in history when one nation would often rule the entire world. For instance, in the 1st century, in the time of Jesus and the apostles, that nation that ruled the entire world in that time was Rome. And the person who was assigned to rule the world back then on behalf of Rome was called the Roman Emperor. And what we know from history was that after Jesus ascended and the church was first established, yes, the Jewish people were still obviously very much hostile towards this early church. However, the Roman government led by these Roman emperors initially were surprisingly all in all very much at peace with this new religion called Christianity. However, this peaceful disposition towards the Christians and this religion called Christianity all of a sudden came to an end when a new Roman emperor named Nero eventually took over the office. Because a few years into Emperor Nero's reign in the year 64 AD, something happened. A big fire broke out across a large section of Rome, burning a lot of Rome's property. And what transpired from there was that the Roman citizens, for whatever reason, started to have suspicions that Emperor Nero himself had started this fire deliberately. And therefore, because these suspicions that were circulating around were very much harming Nero's reputation, Nero therefore came up with a plan to falsely accuse the Christians in Rome of deliberately starting this fire in order to cover up his own back. And because Nero was a very disturbed man, instead of just falsely convicting these Christians in Rome of this crime and then just simply locking them up in prison, Nero instead went as far as crucifying on a cross every single confessing Christian he could find in Rome, and then he burned them all alive. And what is amazing is that despite this religion called Christianity being threatened by Nero in this way, these Christians still refused to renounce their faith. They still held to their beliefs about Jesus, even though they knew that holding that to belief was about to cost them their lives. And the famous Roman historian in that time named Tacitus describes what happened in this way. He said this, quote, "Mockery was heaped on them," the Christians, in their deaths. They were covered in the skins of wild beasts, torn to death by dogs, crucified, or set ablaze, so that when nighttime fell, they lit up everything like torches. Nero had opened up his own gardens for this spectacle and gave a show in the arena where he mingled with the crowd, or stood in the garb of a charioteer in a chariot. Consequently, people began to feel compassion for them, the Christians, for they realized that they were being killed not for the public good, but to gratify one man's madness. Now, this horrific outbreak of persecution on our fellow brothers and sisters here by a very sick Emperor Nero is to date one of the most severe cases of persecution that the church has seen. Many Christians were tortured and killed in this way on crosses under Nero's reign. What is really interesting about all this is that Mark's gospel that we're reading today was actually written by Mark right here in Rome, and not too long before the time of these events here under Nero. And therefore what that means is that some of the very first readers of Mark's gospel after it was first written, within those first several years, were Christians who either survived this mass persecution under Nero, or at the very least had heard all about it. And if therefore we are right now to put ourselves into their shoes right now, into the shoes of some of the very first readers of Mark's gospel here, how do you think they would have interpreted this command here by Jesus in verse 34 to, quote, "take up their cross"? What do you reckon the symbol of a cross back then meant to them? Well, I think it's pretty clear that because of what they have just witnessed under Nero, a Roman cross in their eyes, a Roman cross in literally anyone's eyes back then in the whole first century, was never the symbol or the sign of just a little bit of suffering. Now, the symbol of a cross to them back then in the first century was always the symbol of severe suffering, humiliation, and premature death. And therefore, if we were to grab this command here by Jesus to take up our cross and then put it into the correct context of the first century when this was written, what we realize is that we're now able to see what Jesus is truly asking of us here. What Jesus is truly asking of us here is if we are to be true disciples of Him today, then we have to be willing to put Him, Jesus, and His kingdom first over literally everything in our lives, even if we have to take up a cross daily for Him and carry it to the place of suffering or humiliation or even premature death for Him. If we are to be true disciples of Him today, then that's what our heart's attitude needs to be. We need to put Jesus first, no matter how heavy a cross we have to take up for Him. Now, yes, we Christians today in the Western world are very fortunate, and that we haven't really had to face this kind of level of persecution that our brothers and sisters under Nero faced. But who knows, that we might have to face that in the future. We just don't know. However, that doesn't mean that this command is not also applicable for us today too, because there are still many ways in which we Christians today in the Western world are still called to take up our cross daily for Jesus. For example, one way we can take up our cross daily for Jesus today is by maybe inviting our unbelieving friends to our church events. even if it means embarrassment. Another way is by saying no to sinful behaviours, even if it means we might be left out for it by people like our work colleagues. And maybe one final way is by saying no to wearing purple on LGBTQ Wear It Purple Day at work, even if it means it causes conflict with others. Yes, our salvation is in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross alone and nothing that we do. However, nonetheless, Jesus still calls us true disciples to still take up our cross daily for him. That is what we are called to do. And what that means is that there is a cost to being a true disciple of Jesus today. All right, let's now take a look at the third and final command of these three commands here, the command to follow Jesus. The command to follow Jesus. Now, what Jesus means here by this third command to follow him is that he's not asking us to literally follow him physically wherever he goes, because obviously Jesus is not here on this earth anymore for us to physically follow him. No, what Jesus means here by this command to follow him is that we are to follow his ways. Or in other words, we are to imitate his ways, imitate him. We aren't just merely to join his side. No, we are to imitate him in everything that he does. And therefore, as we reflect right now on everything Jesus did while he was here on this earth, what were some of the things that Jesus did here on this earth that we can imitate today ourselves? Well, that's obviously a long list, isn't it? Because he obviously did a lot of things. But if we were to summarize all of it down to just two primary things which encapsulates everything that Jesus did on earth, what would those two primary things be? Can you see it? Number one, on this earth, Jesus denied himself for the sake of his Father's glory and for the sake of others. And number two, he took up a cross in order to save the human race. You see, the reason why Jesus commands us here to both deny ourselves and to take up our cross is literally because that's exactly what he did. Don't you see that the goal of discipleship is to imitate our Lord? He lived that way. And therefore we are to live that way too. However, despite this similarity here between what Jesus did on earth and what we are called to do in these commands here, despite the similarities, what we still need to keep in mind and understand is that Jesus still denied so much more of himself than we will ever have to today. And he also took up a much heavier cross than we will ever have to take up today. And that is because when we in command number one here are called to deny ourselves today for the sake of God's glory and for the sake of others, we're simply just called to deny a focus on the self. That's it. Whereas Jesus, he was called to deny so much more than just that. Yes, Jesus was also called to deny a focus on himself. But in also becoming a human being, he also had to deny some of the very privileges of his divine nature as well. For instance, just to become a human being on earth, Jesus had to deny his privilege of living in paradise in heaven. He also had to deny his privilege as God of being free from the effects of sin such as tiredness and pain. And thirdly, more importantly, he denied his privilege as a righteous man to not have to go through with the cross. He had a right to not have to go through with the cross. Because even though we sinners today deserve exactly what Jesus did on the cross, he didn't. And yet, despite not deserving the cross, Jesus still denied himself of that right anyway for us. Again, Jesus denied so much more of himself for us than we will ever have to today for him. And secondly, when we in command number two here are also called to take up our cross today, The most we are called to do with that command is to do what those Christians under Nero did. And that is to suffer and die for the faith. As we know, that's the very worst of it. Whereas when Jesus was called to take up his cross, what is really interesting is that Jesus wasn't just called to face physical suffering and death on a cross like those Christians under Nero. Now, did you know that Jesus was called to face something far worse than just that on the cross? Because when darkness came over that land for 3 hours, Jesus on that cross had to face the equivalence of eternity in hell. That darkness that came over that land for 3 hours was actually supposed to be symbolic of the present reality that on that cross, the wrath of God in those moments was being poured out on Jesus. The cross that Jesus had to take up was literally having to take hell for us on our behalf, which was far worse than the physical pain of the nails in his hands. And the reason Jesus took up that heavier cross for us was so that the cross that we are called to take up today will never have to include that. Again, Jesus denied so much more of himself than we will ever have to today, and he also took up a much heavier cross than we will ever have to take up today. This right here is where we get this strength to live this way. This right here is where we get this strength to live out these 3 commands here by looking straight at Jesus and what he was willing to do out of love for us. It's only when we look at that infinite love that he had for us in doing all of this that we can find the strength to live that way exactly like he did. Verse 34, again to close. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." May we imitate our Saviour by also living this way for him.